When my grown son whispered a childhood survival code over the phone in the dead of night, I knew he was surrounded. He did not say hello. He just breathed into the receiver and begged me not to come alone. I risked everything to drive to his house anyway, and by midnight I found a military-grade tracking device stitched deep inside his backpack. Before I tell you how I dismantled the trap they set for him, I need to know something. Have you ever felt that ice-cold dread when a loved one's voice just sounds completely wrong? Drop a yes in the comments right now if you know exactly what that feeling is. It was 11:45 on a Tuesday night. At 64 years old, my sleeping habits are light. 30 years working as a skip tracer and bounty hunter in the worst parts of Chicago trains your brain to never fully shut off. You learn to sleep with one ear listening for the sound of a broken window or a ringing phone. When my cell phone vibrated on the nightstand, my eyes snapped open. The caller ID said Lucas. My son is 34. He is a pediatric emergency room nurse with a gentle heart and a quiet life. He never calls past 9 unless it is an absolute emergency. I answered the phone expecting to hear background noise from the hospital. Instead, there was just a heavy, ragged breathing. I asked him what was wrong. His voice was so low it barely registered over the speaker. "Dad," he whispered. "My car has a flat tire on the passenger side." My blood stopped moving in my veins. The temperature in my bedroom felt like it plummeted 20 degrees. That was not a random complaint about a car. That was a phrase we had not spoken out loud in 2 decades. When Lucas was a teenager, my line of work brought dangerous people around our neighborhood. I taught him a verbal panic button. The flat tire code meant exactly one thing. I am cornered. I am being watched. Do not trust anyone around me and come right now. But what he said next shattered whatever professional calm I had left. He took a sharp breath and added, "Please do not come alone." Then the line went dead. He did not say goodbye. He did not explain. He just hung up. I sat on the edge of the bed for exactly 3 seconds to let the reality of the situation anchor into my mind. Someone had my son backed into a corner in his own home. For 3 decades, I made a very good living tracking down bail jumpers, con artists, and violent fugitives. I spent my life hunting predators. I thought I had retired from that life. I thought I left the paranoia behind. But tonight the prey was my own flesh and blood. I stood up and moved to the heavy steel safe bolted to the floor of my closet. I bypassed the combination and used the biometric scanner. I did not grab my fishing gear or my golf clubs. I reached into the back and pulled out a professional radio frequency bug detector wand. Then I grabbed my legally registered 9mm sidearm and 3 extra magazines. You do not ask a man to bring backup to fix a flat tire. You ask for backup when you expect a gunfight. I dressed in dark, non-reflective clothing out of pure muscle memory. I laced up my boots, feeling the familiar weight of the holster against my hip. It had been 5 years since I carried a weapon with the intention of drawing it. Every joint in my body ached with age, but the adrenaline washed it all away. I grabbed my keys and walked out into the cold night air. My truck engine roared to life, breaking the suburban silence. The drive to his upscale neighborhood usually takes 30 minutes. I made it in 14. The streets were empty, illuminated only by the rhythmic passing of orange streetlights. My mind raced through 1,000 terrifying scenarios. Lucas was married to Rachel, a woman I had never fully trusted, but I kept my mouth shut for the sake of peace. Was there a home invasion? Was someone holding them hostage? Or was the threat coming from inside the house? The phrase, "do not trust anyone around me," echoed over and over in my head. That meant whoever was watching him was close. Intimately close. I killed my headlights 2 blocks away from his house. I parked my truck down a side street, completely hidden under the canopy of an old oak tree. I checked the chamber of my weapon. I turned on the bug sweeper and calibrated it to silent mode, letting it vibrate in my palm instead of beeping. The night was dead silent, but I could feel the hostility in the air. I stepped out of the truck and melted into the shadows of the manicured lawns. I was no longer an old man visiting his family. I was a hunter returning to the dark. And God have mercy on whoever was waiting for me inside that house. I killed the engine of my truck 2 blocks down from my son's house. The neighborhood was one of those pristine, gated communities where every lawn is manicured to perfection and every driveway holds a luxury vehicle. It was the kind of place where people paid millions of dollars to feel safe and secure. But as a man who spent 30 years hunting violent fugitives across the country, I knew the ugly truth about these suburban fortresses. I knew that high fences and security cameras rarely kept the monsters out. More often than not, they only served to trap the prey inside. I stepped out into the biting night air and made my way down the sidewalk. I kept to the deep shadows cast by the massive decorative oak trees lining the street. My heavy boots made absolutely no sound on the cold pavement. I kept my right hand resting lightly over my jacket pocket, feeling the cold steel of my sidearm. I approached the 2-story brick colonial house. There were no lights on downstairs. A single faint glow came from the master bedroom window on the 2nd floor. That was where Rachel, my son's wife, was supposedly sleeping. I never really liked Rachel. She had a smile that never quite reached her eyes, and a subtle habit of isolating Lucas from anyone who actually cared about him. But tonight was not about my distaste for my daughter-in-law. Tonight was about pure survival. I slipped through the side wooden gate, testing the metal hinges to make sure they would not squeak and give away my position. I moved swiftly across the back patio and approached the glass sliding door. I tapped a specialized rhythm on the glass pane. 2 rapid knocks, a pause, then 1 heavy strike. It was another old skip tracer code from his childhood. Less than 10 seconds later, in tens, the heavy deadbolt clicked. The glass door slid open just enough for me to slip inside. The kitchen was pitch black. It was illuminated only by the digital glow of the microwave clock showing 12:15 in the morning. Lucas was standing perfectly still by the kitchen island. Even in the dim light, I could see the sheer panic radiating from his entire body. He was wearing his dark blue hospital scrubs, pretending to pack his tactical nursing backpack for a morning shift that was still 6 hours away. His hands were shaking so violently, he could barely manage to zip the nylon compartments. He looked exactly like a hostage trying to act normal, while a loaded gun was pointed directly at his back. I stepped forward and grabbed him firmly by the shoulders. My paternal instinct screamed at me to ask him what was wrong, to demand answers and protect my boy. But I knew better. In my line of work, the very first rule of entering a compromised location is absolute silence. You never speak a single word until you know the air is completely clear of listening devices. I pulled him into a tight embrace. I could feel his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird desperately trying to escape a cage. He leaned his head against my shoulder and let out a long, shaky breath, but he did not utter a single syllable. He just stepped back, reached into the front pocket of his hospital scrubs, and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He pressed the paper deep into my palm. His eyes darted nervously up toward the ceiling, specifically staring at the air conditioning vent directly above the kitchen island. Then he looked toward the dark staircase leading up to the master bedroom where Rachel was sleeping. He was absolutely terrified of making even the slightest sound. I unfolded the paper slowly, holding it up to catch the faint blue light coming from the street lamp shining through the window. The handwriting was jagged and hurried. It looked nothing like my son's usually precise medical script. It read, "She is watching. She knows my schedule." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. She. He did not write they. He did not write someone. He wrote she. My mind instantly raced through the possibilities. Was he talking about Rachel sleeping upstairs? Or was he talking about his mother, my ex-wife, Vivian? Vivian ran a massive private security firm and had a terrifying, toxic obsession with controlling every single aspect of his adult life. It did not matter right now. What mattered was that my son believed his own home was a deadly trap, and his every single move was being actively monitored by a predator. I folded the note and slipped it securely into my front pocket. I looked at Lucas and gave him a single firm nod of understanding. I transitioned instantly from a worried father into the seasoned bounty hunter who had torn apart hundreds of cartel trap houses looking for hidden targets. I reached inside my heavy jacket and pulled out my professional radio frequency detector wand. I flipped the toggle switch on the side to silent operation mode. The device would not make a sound, but a row of red indicator lights along the handle would illuminate, and the thick grip would vibrate intensely the closer it got to an active transmitting signal. I motioned for Lucas to stand perfectly still with his arms raised out to his sides. I started the physical sweep. I ran the thick wand down his chest along his arms and down both of his legs. Nothing happened. The handle remained cold and completely still. I moved over to sweep the marble kitchen island, hovering the device over his leather wallet, his car keys, and his cell phone. Still nothing. Lucas stood there, frozen cold sweat beading on his forehead, despite the chill in the dark room. He pointed a trembling finger at his heavy tactical nursing backpack resting on one of the wooden bar stools. It was a rugged multi-compartment bag he took absolutely everywhere, carrying his stethoscope medical shears and daily shift gear. I stepped slowly toward the bag. The moment the tip of the detection wand crossed within 12 inches of the thick nylon fabric, the device came alive. The handle vibrated violently in my palm, buzzing like a live electrical wire. All 5 red indicator lights flared blindingly bright in the dark kitchen. The signal strength was absolutely massive. This was not a cheap commercial Bluetooth tracking tag you buy at an electronics store. This was an active, high-powered cellular transmission device radiating directly from his personal bag. Something deeply hidden inside that backpack was broadcasting his exact location and potentially his voice to whoever was hunting him in the dark. The red indicator lights on my detection wand burned brightly in the pitch-black kitchen, illuminating the sheer terror on my son's face. The signal was radiating directly from the heavy tactical backpack resting on the wooden bar stool. I lowered the detection wand and handed it to Lucas, motioning for him to hold it steady. I needed both of my hands for what came next. In my line of work, you never just rip into a container holding an active surveillance device. You treat it like an unexploded piece of ordnance because you have absolutely no idea what kind of secondary triggers or tamper alarms the installer might have rigged. I reached into the tactical pocket of my heavy jacket and pulled out a small folding razor blade. It was a specialized tool I used for cutting through heavy restraints and thick upholstery when searching for hidden contraband during my bounty hunting days. I clicked the blade open. The sharp metallic snap echoed entirely too loudly in the quiet kitchen. Lucas flinched, his eyes darting upstairs again, terrified that his wife Rachel would wake up and come down to find us. I gave him a stern look demanding his absolute focus. I approached the backpack and began a meticulous physical inspection, using only my fingertips. It was a rugged black nylon bag designed for emergency medical personnel. It had dozens of separate compartments, heavy-duty zippers, and reinforced stitching. I started at the top, slowly running my hands along the seams, feeling for anything rigid or out of place. I checked the main compartment, which held his stethoscope trauma shears, and a handful of brightly colored pediatric stickers he gave to his young patients in the emergency room. Seeing those innocent items packed away for his next shift sent a wave of hot, protective anger through my chest. My son dedicated his life to saving sick children, and someone was treating him like a violent fugitive. I moved my hands down to the padded back panel. This was the section designed to rest flush against his spine when he wore the bag. The heavy foam padding was intended to provide lumbar support, making it the absolute perfect place to hide something bulky. I pressed my thumbs deeply into the thick mesh fabric, inching my way from the top handle all the way down to the reinforced bottom seam. Right at the lower left corner, about 2 inches from the main zipper, my thumb hit something hard. It was completely concealed beneath the outer layer of nylon, but it felt like a solid rectangular block roughly the size of a deck of playing cards. I tapped the exact spot with my index finger and looked at Lucas. He stared at my hand, his face completely drained of color. He shook his head slowly, mouthing the words that he had never felt that before. I positioned the tip of my razor blade against the heavy black nylon seam. I did not want to cut straight through the middle of the fabric and risk damaging the device or triggering a tamper switch. I needed to open the lining along the original stitch line. I pressed the razor in and carefully pulled upward, slicing through the heavy synthetic threads one by one. The fabric separated with a soft, tearing sound. I peeled back the dark nylon mesh, exposing the thick yellow foam padding underneath. I used the tip of the blade to carve a small square into the foam, digging down until I felt the steel scrape against hard plastic. I put the knife down and wedged 2 fingers into the cavity I had just created. I gripped the hard plastic edges of the hidden object and slowly pulled it free from the foam block. It was a rectangular black box made of highly durable polycarbonate material. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, indicating a massive lithium-ion battery pack designed for long-term deployment. There were no commercial logos on the front. There was no brand name or consumer labeling whatsoever. It was completely sterile. This was not a cheap tracking tag you could buy on the internet or pick up at a local electronics store. This was a professional-grade asset tracking device, the kind of hardware used by federal law enforcement agencies and high-end military contractors. I turned the device over in the palm of my hand, bringing it closer to the faint blue light shining through the kitchen window. On the back panel, etched perfectly into the black plastic, was a long alphanumeric serial number alongside a tiny square barcode. My eyes scanned the sequence of letters and numbers. VANG-774. My stomach dropped completely out of my body. A cold, paralyzing wave of nausea washed over me, hitting me harder than any physical blow I had ever taken in my 30 years on the streets. I recognized that specific manufacturing prefix. I knew exactly where this device came from, and I knew exactly who had purchased it. The prefix stood for Vanguard Executive Solutions. It was an elite private security firm specializing in corporate espionage, high-risk asset recovery, and aggressive surveillance operations. And the sole owner and chief executive officer of that firm was a woman named Vivian, my ruthless ex-wife, Lucas's own mother. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt too thick to breathe. I stared at the serial number, trying to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. Vivian and I had divorced 20 years ago because I could no longer tolerate her obsession with total, absolute control. She was a woman who viewed human beings as property. When Lucas decided to become a nurse instead of joining her massive corporate security empire, she viewed it as the ultimate unforgivable betrayal. She cut him off financially and emotionally, treating him like a rogue asset rather than a son. But I knew her psychological profile better than anyone. Vivian never truly let anything go. If she could not control Lucas through financial manipulation, she would find another way to dominate his existence. She had used her own security firm to requisition a military-grade tracking device, and somehow she had managed to get it physically sewn into the lining of his daily work bag. She had turned my son into a blip on a radar screen, monitoring his every single movement from the shadows. The realization that a mother would subject her own child to this level of predatory surveillance filled me with a deep, violent rage. I looked up at Lucas, wanting to explain what I had just found, but the words caught in my throat. How do you tell a young man that his own mother is hunting him like an animal? I took a deep breath, forcing the personal emotions down, and letting the cold, analytical bounty hunter take the wheel. I had found the tracker. We knew how she was monitoring his location. The immediate threat was isolated and in my possession. I reached into my pocket to pull out a specialized signal-blocking pouch designed to act as a miniature Faraday cage. Once I dropped the tracker inside the pouch, it would completely sever its connection to the cellular network, blinding Vivian and giving us the opportunity to get Lucas out of the house undetected. But as I tilted the black plastic box to slide it into the metallic pouch, something caught my eye. Right next to the serial number hidden beneath a tiny piece of transparent plastic, a microscopic blue light flashed. It was incredibly faint, pulsing in a steady, rhythmic heartbeat. One flash every 3 seconds. My blood ran absolutely cold. Standard global positioning trackers do not pulse blue. They pulse green when searching for satellites and solid red when the battery is dying. A blue pulsing light on a Vanguard tracking device meant it was actively transmitting data over a high-speed global system for mobile communications network. It meant this device was not just pinging his location to a map. I quickly flipped the box back over and ran my thumb along the smooth top edge. Right in the center, there was a microscopic pinhole no larger than the tip of a needle. It was an active cellular listening bug, a live microphone. The silence in the kitchen suddenly felt like a massive, crushing weight. She had not just been tracking his location. Vivian had been actively listening to his every single breath. She had heard the sound of the glass door sliding open. She had heard my heavy boots on the floor. She had heard the metallic snap of my razor blade opening and the sound of the nylon tearing as I sliced her trap wide open. And worst of all, she heard the exact moment I pulled the device out of the foam. These high-end military trackers were equipped with internal photodiode proximity alarms. The moment the device was removed from the absolute darkness of the backpack lining and exposed to the ambient light of the kitchen, a tamper alert was instantly triggered on the monitoring end. Vivian knew we found it. She knew her surveillance had been compromised. And a woman like Vivian did not just sit back and watch a monitor. She kept active extraction teams on standby. Suddenly, the dark kitchen walls were violently illuminated. Twin beams of bright white halogen headlights swept aggressively across the front window blinds, casting long, jagged shadows across the kitchen island. The heavy rumble of high-powered engines echoed from the street outside, directly in front of the house. They were not trying to be quiet anymore. The trap had been sprung. I looked at Lucas, grabbing him by the shoulder and pulling him hard toward the back door. The tracking device burned in my hand like a live coal. We had exactly 60 seconds to run before the front door was kicked off its hinges. The heavy rumble of high-powered engines vibrated violently through the floorboards of the dark kitchen. Through the narrow slats of the front window blinds, I watched 2 matte black sports utility vehicles aggressively jump the curb and completely block the driveway. They parked at tactical angles with their front bumpers angled inward, specifically designed to prevent anyone from backing a car out of the garage. The headlights cut the darkness of the quiet suburban street, turning the manicured front lawn into a stark theater of intimidation. I grabbed my son by the shoulder and pulled him away from the window before the sweeping beams could catch our silhouettes against the glass. Lucas was shaking uncontrollably. I told him to go upstairs right now and get Lily. I told him not to turn on any lights, not to pack any toys, and most importantly, not to wake Rachel. I gave him exactly 2 minutes to bring my 5-year-old granddaughter down to the back door. He nodded, his eyes wide with sheer terror, and vanished up the dark staircase without making a sound. I turned my attention back to the front window to assess the immediate threat. 4 heavily built men stepped out of the vehicles. They were dressed in dark, tactical clothing completely devoid of any official police or government insignias. They wore heavy-duty boots and thick utility belts holding large flashlights and plastic zip ties, but no visible firearms. That specific detail told me everything I needed to know about the situation outside. They were private security contractors on Vivian's payroll. They were highly paid corporate muscle sent to intimidate and extract, not to engage in a lawful arrest. I checked the chamber of my 9mm sidearm one last time, making sure a round was seated perfectly. I engaged the safety and tucked the weapon into the small of my back, completely hidden beneath my heavy winter jacket, but instantly accessible to my right hand. I was not going to hide in the kitchen and wait for them to kick the door off its hinges. In my 30 years of hunting dangerous fugitives across the country, I learned a critical lesson about violent confrontations. Whoever controls the initial space controls the entire interaction. You never let a predator gain entry to your territory. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped out onto the front porch, pulling the door shut behind me until the deadbolt clicked securely into place. The crisp night air hit my face, but the cold was absolutely nothing compared to the ice running through my veins. The 4 men stopped dead in their tracks halfway up the front concrete walkway. The man in the lead was huge, easily standing 6'4", with the thick neck and rigid posture of a former military operator. He clicked on a heavy tactical flashlight and shined the blinding white beam directly into my eyes, trying to blind and disorient me. I did not raise my hand to block the light. I did not flinch or step back. I just stood there on the top step, staring straight down the blinding beam, letting the heavy silence stretch until it became incredibly uncomfortable for them. The lead contractor finally lowered the beam just enough to illuminate my torso. He cleared his throat and tried to project a voice of false authority. He stated they were conducting a late-night welfare check on the resident of the home due to a highly concerning medical report. He demanded that I step aside immediately and open the front door. I let out a slow, measured breath. I did not yell. I kept my voice terrifyingly calm and entirely even. I told him he was standing on private residential property at 12:30 in the morning without a police badge, without a judicial warrant, and without an invitation. The contractor puffed out his chest and took a heavy step forward, stating that he worked for Vanguard Executive Solutions, and they had legal authorization from a concerned family member to verify my son's physical safety. He reached out his thick hand to grab the wooden porch railing. I immediately shifted my weight, planting my feet shoulder-width apart and dropping my right hand casually to the small of my back. The movement was incredibly subtle, but to a trained tactical operator it was a massive, flashing red flag. The contractor froze instantly, his hand hovering just inches from the wooden railing. I looked him dead in the eyes and stripped away all the polite corporate nonsense. I told him I knew exactly who signed his paycheck. I told him Vivian sent him here to do her dirty work, but Vivian was sitting safely in a high-rise office right now while he was standing on the fatal end of a very bad decision. I recited the exact state penal code for armed trespassing. I reminded him that under the local castle doctrine, a homeowner or their lawful guest has absolutely no duty to retreat when faced with a nighttime home invasion by unidentified hostile individuals. I lowered my voice to a dangerous, raspy whisper and told him that if he took one more step up my stairs, I would consider it an act of lethal aggression. I promised him I would put 3 hollow-point rounds into his chest before his brain even registered the sound of the gunshot. I asked him directly if Vivian was paying him enough money to bleed out on a cold suburban sidewalk while his 3 buddies ran back to the trucks. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched the tactical calculus playing out behind his dark eyes. He looked at my rigid posture. He looked at the calm, dead expression on my face. He realized in that exact moment that I was not a terrified civilian or a bluffing old man. He realized I was a seasoned professional who had done this 1,000 times before, and I was entirely prepared to end his life to protect my blood. He slowly lowered his hands, keeping his palms facing outward to show he was not reaching for a weapon. He took one deliberate step backward down the concrete walkway. He motioned with his chin, and the 3 other men began to slowly retreat toward the idling vehicles. The lead contractor pulled a radio from his belt and turned his back to call his command center, undoubtedly trying to get Vivian on the line to ask for new operational orders. I knew this was the only window of opportunity we were going to get tonight. I waited until they were huddled behind the armored doors of their vehicles before I slipped back inside the house and locked the deadbolt. Lucas was waiting by the kitchen island, holding his 5-year-old daughter Lily tightly against his chest. She was wearing her little pink pajamas, rubbing her sleepy eyes, and clutching a small stuffed bear. Lucas looked absolutely terrified, but he had followed my instructions perfectly. He had left everything behind. There were no bags, no coats, and no cell phones, just the clothes on their backs. I grabbed Lucas by the arm and guided him through the dark kitchen toward the sliding glass patio door. We slipped out into the freezing backyard. I led them through the wooden side gate, navigating the deep shadows cast by the tall privacy fences. We moved rapidly through the neighboring yards, avoiding motion sensor security lights and dry patches of leaves that would crunch under our boots. Every time a dog barked in the distance, Lucas flinched, but he kept moving, holding Lily tight to his chest to keep her warm. We crossed 2 full residential blocks in total darkness before my dark truck finally came into view. I unlocked the doors remotely as we approached. I opened the rear passenger door and pushed Lucas and Lily inside, telling them to stay extremely low on the floorboards. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. I kept the headlights completely off and shifted into drive, pulling away from the curb and melting into the suburban shadows. We had escaped the immediate trap, but the war for my son's life had only just begun. I kept the headlights of my truck completely off until we were 4 blocks away from the subdivision. Only when I was absolutely certain that the sweeping beams of the tactical sports utility vehicles were no longer in my rearview mirror did I reach down and click the lights on. I checked the rear camera display. The street behind me was entirely empty, but I knew that meant absolutely nothing. Vivian did not build a multi-million-dollar corporate security empire by hiring amateurs who gave up after one failed confrontation on a front porch. They had retreated only to regroup and call in their mobile pursuit units. We were currently driving a massive heavy-duty truck that was incredibly easy to spot on an empty suburban road at 1 o'clock in the morning. I needed to get us off the main grid immediately. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the heavy adrenaline pumping through my chest. My mind automatically shifted into the evasion protocols I had utilized hundreds of times when transporting high-risk fugitives across state lines. The first rule of anti-surveillance driving is to break the visual line of sight and establish an unpredictable pattern. I approached the intersection of a major arterial road, but instead of taking the logical route toward the interstate highway, I took 3 consecutive hard right turns into an older, densely packed industrial park. The roads here were poorly lit and lined with massive corrugated steel warehouses and chained link fences. It was a labyrinth of loading docks and narrow alleyways that would force any pursuing vehicle to either slow down significantly or reveal themselves by accelerating to close the gap. I checked my mirrors again. Still nothing, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. They were out there. I could feel it. I glanced into the back seat. Lucas was huddled on the floorboards with his arms wrapped tightly around Lily. My granddaughter was remarkably quiet, burying her face in her father's chest. She was too young to understand the complex danger we were in, but she was old enough to feel the pure terror radiating from the 2 men she trusted most in the world. I needed to get them to a secure location, but I could not risk leading a tale directly to my brother-in-law's doorstep. I reached into my center console and pulled out my heavy-duty work phone. I tossed it over the center console, landing it on the floor mat next to Lucas. I told him to take out his phone and his smartwatch right now. He looked up at me completely confused. I explained in a sharp, fast tone that even though we left the physical tracking bug back at the house, modern smartphones constantly broadcast location data to nearby cellular towers. Vivian had access to highly sophisticated digital exploitation tools. If she could afford military-grade hardware, she could easily afford the software required to ping the integrated GPS chips inside our personal devices. I told him we had to go entirely dark. Lucas did not argue. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and unclasped the digital watch from his wrist. He piled them together with my phone on the floorboard. We were approaching the western edge of the industrial park, which bordered a set of active commercial train tracks. I knew this area well from my days working skip traces on cargo thieves. A massive freight train was currently rolling through the crossing, moving slowly at about 15 miles per hour on its way toward the state line. Its horn blared loudly in the cold night air, rattling the windows of my truck. This was the perfect opportunity to create a false trail. I accelerated slightly, pacing my truck alongside the moving train as we traveled down the parallel access road. I rolled down my driver's side window, letting the freezing wind whip through the cabin. I grabbed the 3 electronic devices from the floorboard. I waited until an open hopper car full of industrial scrap metal passed directly next to my window. With a hard lateral throw, I hurled all 3 devices out into the darkness. I heard a faint metallic clatter as they landed safely inside the moving steel container. If Vivian's security team managed to triangulate our cellular signals, they would find themselves chasing a freight train traveling 70 miles per hour in the absolute opposite direction of where we were actually going. We were officially off the grid. No trackers, no phones, no digital footprint whatsoever. I rolled up the window and took a sharp left turn, crossing beneath a concrete highway overpass and merging onto a secondary local route that connected to the poorer residential districts on the south side of the city. I drove in complete silence for another 20 minutes, utilizing every evasive driving technique I knew. I changed lanes randomly at intersections. I drove under the speed limit to force anyone tailing me to either pass or ride their brakes. I took a sudden detour through a sprawling apartment complex with multiple exits, making sure absolutely no one followed us through the maze of parked cars. Only when I had driven a complete counter-surveillance loop and confirmed the darkness behind me was truly empty did I finally allow my heart rate to slow down. I reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror to look at my son. Lucas was sitting up slightly, leaning against the leather seat, holding Lily as she finally drifted to sleep in his arms. The streetlights flashed across his pale, exhausted face. He looked at me with a profound mixture of immense relief and total devastation. He had just lost his home, his wife, and the entire life he had spent years building, all within the span of a single, terrifying hour. I reached a hand backward, gripping his knee firmly in the dark cabin. I told him that he did incredible back there. I told him that I was proud of him for remembering the code and calling me when the walls closed in. He let out a shaky breath and nodded, closing his eyes as a single tear rolled down his cheek. We were safe for the moment, but I knew this quiet stretch of road was only the eye of the hurricane. We were heading toward my brother-in-law's house, where the real work would begin. We had to figure out exactly why Vivian was hunting her own son, and we had to prepare for the massive war that was about to break at sunrise. I pulled into the narrow driveway of a modest single-story brick house on the quiet south side of the city. The property looked entirely unremarkable from the street, with its neatly trimmed hedges and dark windows. But I knew the security system wired into the walls and doors of this home was significantly more advanced than most commercial bank vaults. This was the sanctuary of Isaiah Washington. Isaiah is a 62-year-old African-American man with a commanding physical presence, an unshakable calm, and a mind like a steel trap. More importantly, He is my brother-in-law. He is the older brother of my late wife, and the only man on this entire planet I would trust unconditionally with my son's life. For 3 decades, Isaiah worked as a city emergency dispatch supervisor, listening to the absolute worst moments of human existence through a headset while coordinating police and medical responses. When he finally retired, he turned his immense technical skills toward forensic data recovery and private cybersecurity. I cut the engine of the truck and led Lucas and Lily quickly up the concrete walkway. I did not even have to knock on the reinforced steel door. Isaiah had already seen us on his encrypted perimeter cameras. The heavy deadbolt slid back, and the door opened before we reached the top step. Isaiah stood in the doorway, wearing a dark sweater, his sharp eyes immediately scanning the dark street behind us before focusing on my face. He did not ask any questions about why we were standing on his porch at 2 a.m. without any coats or luggage. He saw the sheer panic in his nephew's eyes, and he saw the sleeping child in his arms. He simply stepped back and motioned for us to get inside immediately. Once the heavy door was locked and secured behind us, the immense physical tension in my shoulders finally cracked just a fraction. Isaiah gently guided Lucas down the hallway to a spare guest bedroom. He helped tuck my 5-year-old granddaughter under a thick, warm quilt, making sure she was completely comfortable and safe. When Isaiah returned to the living room, his gentle uncle persona completely vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, analytical focus of a crisis manager. He looked at me and asked exactly how bad the situation was. I reached into my heavy jacket pocket and pulled out the specialized signal-blocking pouch. I carefully removed the black polycarbonate tracking device and placed it on his coffee table. Isaiah leaned over and examined the small black box. When he read the Vanguard Executive Solutions serial number etched into the plastic, his jaw tightened. He knew exactly who Vivian was, and he knew the terrifying extent of her corporate resources. He recognized the microscopic pinhole microphone and the pulsing blue light indicating the active cellular connection. He told us that Vivian was undoubtedly pinging the device right now, trying to re-establish a connection after I had thrown her pursuit teams off our trail. If we left the device in the blocking pouch, we would be blind to whatever data she had already collected. But if we turned it back on normally, she would instantly have our exact coordinates. Isaiah instructed us to follow him down to his basement. The underground room was a climate-controlled fortress of humming computer servers, multiple heavy-duty monitors, and specialized digital diagnostic equipment. It looked like the command center of a federal intelligence agency. Isaiah walked over to a heavy stainless steel workstation, equipped with a specialized glass and metal enclosure. It was a custom-built Faraday cage designed to completely isolate electronic devices from all external wireless signals, while allowing a user to physically interact with them through shielded portal gloves. He placed the Vanguard tracker inside the chamber and sealed the heavy locking latch. Once the device was completely isolated from the outside world, he connected a series of micro-wired leads from the tracker directly into his secure offline server. He began running a sophisticated extraction protocol to mirror the internal memory of the tracking bug without ever triggering its cellular transmission array. The 3 of us stood in the cold basement, watching the green progress bar slowly creep across the main computer monitor. The humming of the cooling fans was the only sound in the room. When the bar finally hit 100%, a soft chime echoed from the speakers. The data was successfully dumped. We had officially captured the enemy intelligence without exposing our location. We were temporarily safe from the physical pursuit. I let out a deep breath, feeling a momentary wave of relief wash over me. But as Isaiah began to open the decrypted file directories and scan the raw data, his expression darkened dramatically. The momentary safety we felt evaporated instantly. Isaiah did not just find global positioning logs and audio recordings on the device. He found a heavily encrypted backdoor directory that was actively syncing to a remote cloud server managed by Vanguard Executive Solutions. Because the tracker was paired to Vivian's administrative account, Isaiah was able to use the cached security tokens to reverse engineer a connection and peer directly into the private digital dossier she was building against her own son. He clicked open a master folder labeled Medical Conservatorship Protocol and called Lucas and me over to the glowing monitors. What we saw on those screens was not just a surveillance operation. It was a complete, systematic, and deeply malicious character assassination designed to utterly destroy my son's life. Vivian had fabricated a massive, irrefutable digital paper trail. The files contained dozens of spoofed text messages supposedly sent from Lucas's phone to unknown burner numbers desperately begging for illicit narcotics. There were highly sophisticated forged pharmacy inventory logs from the pediatric emergency room where he worked, indicating that hundreds of vials of fentanyl and heavy oxycodone were missing during his specific hospital shifts. The gaslighting was monstrous in its precision. Vivian had manufactured an alternate reality where Lucas was suffering from severe, violent opioid psychosis. She had hired corrupt private medical evaluators to write preliminary psychiatric reports based entirely on the forged data, claiming that he was a profound danger to himself, his patients, and most importantly, his 5-year-old daughter. But the ultimate motive became crystal clear when Isaiah opened the final legal document in the directory. It was a fully drafted legal petition for a permanent involuntary conservatorship. My brother-in-law pointed to the financial addendums attached to the legal filing, and the room went completely dead. When my wife passed away over a decade ago, she left Lucas a highly protected $2 million trust fund designed to guarantee his financial independence and ensure Lily's future education. Vivian had always hated that money because she could not control it. Under the laws of a permanent medical conservatorship, if Lucas was legally declared mentally incompetent and unfit to manage his own affairs, the state would immediately assign a guardian to take absolute control of his entire estate. The petition explicitly named Vivian as the primary executor of his medical rights, his financial assets, and the sole guardian of my granddaughter, Lily. She was not just trying to track him to see where he was going. She was using her immense wealth and corporate power to strip him of his nursing license, steal his $2 million inheritance, and legally kidnap his daughter. She had meticulously orchestrated a scenario where Lucas would be locked away in a forced rehabilitation facility while she absorbed his entire existence into her corporate empire. Lucas stumbled backward away from the monitors, his face completely hollowed out by the sheer horror of his mother's betrayal. He grasped the edge of the metal workbench, struggling to process the reality that the woman who gave birth to him was actively trying to erase his autonomy. I felt a surge of white-hot, righteous anger completely overtake my body. I looked closely at the digital timestamp on the top right corner of the conservatorship petition. The date of the hearing was not scheduled for some distant time in the future. Vivian had used her influence with a corrupt local judge to secure an emergency ex parte hearing. The timestamp indicated that the legal filing was scheduled to be executed in family court at 9:00 tomorrow morning. We did not have weeks or days to prepare a legal defense. We had exactly 8 hours until my son lost his child, his career, and his freedom. The clock was ticking, and the entire weight of the American legal system was about to crash down on our heads. I looked at Isaiah, and then I looked at my son. We were no longer running. We had to pivot immediately from evasion to total war. We had to build a trap of our own before the sun came up. Isaiah stared at the glowing monitors in his basement fortress. The digital clock on the cinder block wall read 2:15 in the morning. We had less than 7 hours before Vivian's high-priced corporate lawyers walked into a family court and legally erased my son's existence. Isaiah pointed to the series of text messages displayed on the main screen. These were the supposed erratic texts, begging for narcotics that Vivian was using as the absolute foundation of her conservatorship petition. Isaiah explained that spoofing a text message to make it look like it came from Lucas's phone was incredibly easy for a massive security firm. They could route the fake messages through proxy servers, making them appear entirely legitimate to any standard medical evaluator or family court judge. But hiding the digital footprint of that spoofing was much harder. Isaiah told us that every single piece of data that enters or leaves a residential home passes through the local internet protocol router. If Vivian's tactical team had remotely accessed the home network to plant those forged messages or monitor his private devices, the router would have kept a silent, hidden log of those foreign internet protocol addresses. To prove the texts were fabricated and to completely destroy Vivian's entire legal case, Isaiah needed the raw encrypted logs from that specific router. But there was a massive technical problem. Vanguard Executive Solutions had locked down the network from the outside. Isaiah could not breach the firewall remotely without triggering a massive digital alarm on their end. The only way to get the data was a physical hardline extraction. Someone had to plug a specialized cloning drive directly into the physical router inside the house. I looked at the digital clock again. The math was brutally simple. I had to go back into the lion's den. Lucas immediately shook his head. He stepped in front of me, his eyes wide with absolute panic. He begged me not to go back. He reminded me that Vivian had armed contractors watching the property, and that Rachel, his treacherous wife, was still sleeping upstairs. If I got caught inside that house at 3 a.m, they would not just arrest me. They would shoot me on sight and claim it was a justified defense against a deranged home invader. I put my hands on my son's shoulders and looked him dead in the eyes. I told him that 30 years of bounty hunting taught me that the absolute last place a predator expects you to go is right back into the trap they just sprung. They thought we were running away terrified into the night. They would never expect an immediate aggressive counterattack. Isaiah opened a heavy metal drawer and pulled out a small black universal serial bus drive. He had configured it with a custom extraction script designed to bypass commercial encryption. He told me that all I had to do was plug it into the back of the router, wait for the green light to turn solid, and pull it out. It would take exactly 2 minutes to clone the entire digital history of the house. I took the drive, slipped it into my pocket, and walked up the basement stairs. The drive back to the upscale suburb felt entirely different than the first time. The initial rush of protective adrenaline had faded completely, replaced by the cold, calculating focus of a man walking intentionally into a combat zone. The streets were completely dead. The temperature had dropped even further, freezing the morning dew onto the windshield of my truck. I did not park 2 blocks away this time. That was entirely too predictable. I drove to the adjacent subdivision, parked behind a massive commercial landscaping van, and walked half a mile through a dense wooded greenbelt that bordered the back of Lucas's neighborhood. I moved through the freezing brush with absolute silence, relying on decades of muscle memory. When I reached the edge of the tree line, I knelt in the damp grass and surveyed the property. The 2 matte black sports utility vehicles were gone from the driveway. But I was not foolish enough to believe Vivian had simply recalled her tactical teams. They were running a covert perimeter now, likely parked on the intersecting streets watching the main access roads with thermal optics. They were guarding the front door, but they were not expecting a ghost to come through the walls. I bypassed the backyard patio entirely. I knew Rachel had a habit of leaving the small utility window in the laundry room slightly cracked to vent the heat from the dryer. It was a tiny structural vulnerability, but in my line of work, a tiny vulnerability is all you need to bring down an entire fortress. I pressed my body flat against the cold brick exterior of the house, carefully avoiding the motion sensor floodlights mounted near the roofline. I reached the laundry room window. It was closed, but not securely latched. I slid my pocket knife into the narrow gap, gently lifting the locking mechanism. The window slid open with a faint metallic scrape that sounded like a gunshot in the dead silence of the night. I waited for 10 agonizing seconds, holding my breath, listening for any movement inside the house. Nothing. Just the low, rhythmic hum of the kitchen refrigerator. I pulled myself through the narrow opening, dropping silently onto the tiled floor of the laundry room. I was back inside the trap. The air felt incredibly heavy, suffocating, and thick with the tension of Rachel sleeping just one floor above me. If she woke up and came downstairs for a glass of water, the entire operation would instantly disintegrate. I drew my sidearm, keeping it pointed safely toward the floor, and moved silently into the main hallway. The home office was located at the front of the house, facing the street. I kept my back pressed against the wall, sliding past the dark staircase leading up to the master bedroom. I could hear the faint sound of the central heating unit kicking on, masking the microscopic sounds of my heavy boots on the hardwood floor. I reached the office door. It was partially open. I slipped inside and knelt beneath the large mahogany desk. The router was a sleek black tower tucked away in the corner, blinking with a rhythmic array of white and blue lights. It was the digital beating heart of Vivian's entire surveillance operation. I holstered my weapon and pulled the black extraction drive from my pocket. My hands were perfectly steady. I felt blindly along the back of the router, locating the open data port. I inserted the drive. Immediately, a small red light illuminated on the side of the plastic casing, indicating that Isaiah's custom script had initiated the override sequence. Now, I just had to wait. 2 minutes sounds like an incredibly short amount of time when you are sitting safely in your living room. But when you are kneeling in the dark inside a hostile environment, with federal crimes being fabricated against your family, 2 minutes stretches into an absolute terrifying eternity. I watched the tiny red light pulse. 1 minute passed. The silence in the house was deafening. Every creak of the wooden floorboards above me sent a spike of pure adrenaline straight into my heart. I kept my eyes locked on the dark doorway, half expecting Rachel to step into the frame or a tactical contractor to crash through the front window. 1 minute and 30 seconds. The red light began to blink faster, indicating the massive transfer of encrypted network logs. I thought about the forged text messages, the fake pharmacy records, and the legal petition sitting on a judge's desk waiting for the morning sun. I thought about my 5-year-old granddaughter sleeping in a basement, completely unaware that her entire future was currently flowing into this tiny black drive. 1 minute and 50 seconds. Suddenly, I heard a distinct sound coming from the floor directly above my head. The unmistakable creak of a bed frame shifting heavily. Someone had just woken up. Footsteps began to move slowly across the ceiling, making their way toward the top of the stairs. My heart stopped. 1 minute and 58 seconds. The light on the drive snapped from flashing red to a solid, brilliant green. The data transfer was complete. I ripped the drive out of the router, shoved it deep into my pocket, and drew my weapon. I backed silently toward the office window, preparing to break the glass and run if the stairs began to creak. The heavy footsteps on the second floor did not head toward the bathroom. They moved deliberately toward the top of the wooden staircase. I stood perfectly still in the dark home office, my hand gripping my sidearm. I had the extraction drive safely in my pocket, but I was trapped. I could not risk climbing back out the narrow laundry room window. The metallic scrape of the frame would instantly alert whoever was coming down those stairs. I backed slowly into the deep shadows behind the heavy mahogany door, pressing my spine flat against the cold drywall. I controlled my breathing, taking shallow, silent breaths through my nose. The staircase groaned under the weight of descending steps. Through the narrow gap between the door hinges, I saw the faint glow of a cell phone flashlight sweep across the hardwood floor of the main hallway. It was Rachel. My daughter-in-law was wearing a silk robe, her face illuminated by the harsh white light of her screen. She walked past the office without looking inside and headed straight for the side entrance of the house that led to the covered driveway. I watched her bypass the keypad for the security alarm. She did not punch in a code. She simply reached up and disabled the perimeter sensors with a master override switch. Then she unlocked the heavy deadbolt and opened the side door. A rush of freezing night air swept down the hallway, followed immediately by the sharp clicking of expensive designer heels on the hardwood floor. A tall woman stepped out of the shadows and into the dim light of the hallway. Even in the darkness, I instantly recognized the rigid posture and the tailored cashmere coat. It was Vivian. My ex-wife had not stayed safely tucked away in her high-rise penthouse. She was here physically coordinating the destruction of our son from inside his own home. I felt a surge of pure, violent hatred spike my adrenaline, but I forced it down. This was an intelligence-gathering operation. I reached up to the collar of my heavy jacket and pressed the activation switch on my digital audio recorder. Because I was standing in the room, I was legally permitted to capture every single word they were about to say. The tiny device vibrated once against my collarbone. Vivian brushed past Rachel and walked into the kitchen, her voice a harsh, demanding whisper. She asked Rachel where Lucas was. Rachel crossed her arms and replied defensively that she did not know. She said she woke up and found the bed empty and assumed he had panicked and run to his father's house after the security contractors showed up on the front porch. Vivian let out a low, cruel laugh. She said that was absolutely perfect. She stated that Lucas fleeing his own home in the middle of the night would look incredibly erratic and paranoid to the family court judge tomorrow morning. It would perfectly corroborate the narrative of a man suffering from severe chemical psychosis. Rachel stepped closer to Vivian, her voice shaking with a mixture of greed and anxiety. Rachel said she had done her part. She said she had taken a massive legal risk, and she wanted absolute confirmation that her compensation was secure. I leaned closer to the hinge of the door, making sure the microphone on my collar was pointed directly down the hallway. Vivian sighed with an air of immense arrogance. She told Rachel not to be so dramatic. Vivian assured her that the offshore accounts were already primed. She stated clearly that the moment the judge signed the conservatorship order at 9:00, giving Vivian total control of Lucas and his $2 million trust fund, a wire transfer would be released. Rachel would receive the deed to the $2.5 million luxury condo overlooking the city exactly as they had agreed. Rachel shook her head nervously. She said Vivian did not understand the sheer stress she had been under. Rachel then confessed to the exact mechanism of their betrayal. The words she spoke next chilled me to the absolute core of my soul. Rachel stated explicitly that for the past 3 weeks, she had been grinding up highly regulated prescription amphetamines and dissolving the powder directly into Lucas's morning coffee. She said it was incredibly difficult to perfectly calculate the trace amounts required to ensure he failed his mandatory hospital drug panels without triggering a fatal cardiac event. The absolute monstrous reality of her words echoed in the dark hallway. She was not just faking text messages. Rachel was actively introducing dangerous narcotics into the bloodstream of a pediatric trauma nurse. She was risking the lives of the innocent children Lucas treated at the hospital just so she could secure a luxury real estate deal funded by his own mother. Vivian placed a cold, reassuring hand on Rachel's shoulder. Vivian praised her, saying she had done a brilliant job. Vivian explained that the trace amounts of amphetamines were the absolute cornerstone of her legal strategy. When the court ordered a mandatory blood panel tomorrow afternoon, the chemical evidence would be undeniably present in his system. No judge would believe Lucas's claims of innocence when his own blood condemned him. Vivian smiled a predatory smile and told Rachel to act like the devastated weeping wife when the police inevitably arrived to serve the warrants. I stood in the dark office recording every single sickening syllable of their conspiracy. A mother and a wife. Two women who were supposed to be the foundational pillars of love in a man's life had formed a demonic alliance to completely obliterate him. Vivian wanted absolute control and the $2 million trust fund. Rachel wanted a high society divorce without any of the messy legal battles over assets. Together, they had turned my son's life into a lethal biochemical trap. My hand gripped the handle of my 9mm sidearm so tightly my knuckles ached. The protective rage burning inside my chest screamed at me to step out of the shadows. It demanded that I walk down that hallway, point my weapon directly at Vivian's chest, and force them both to their knees. But 30 years of hunting criminals had taught me the ultimate difference between raw vengeance and true justice. If I stepped out now, I would be nothing more than an armed trespasser. Vivian would use her massive wealth and high-priced lawyers to spin the narrative. She would claim I broke in and held them hostage. The recording would be deemed inadmissible due to coercion. I would spend the rest of my life in a federal penitentiary, and Lucas would still be stripped of his freedom. True justice required absolute patience. It required letting the predator believe they had won right up until the exact moment the steel trap snapped shut on their own neck. I forced myself to remain completely motionless, hidden behind the thick mahogany door. The tiny digital recorder on my collar continued to capture the pristine audio of their damning conversation. I had the router data to prove the text messages were completely spoofed. And now, I had an undeniable audio confession proving interstate wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, and the intentional chemical poisoning of a medical professional. Vivian turned away from Rachel and pulled her heavy cashmere coat tighter around her shoulders. She told Rachel she was heading back to the command center to finalize the legal paperwork for the judge. She instructed Rachel to lock the doors and call the local police precinct precisely at dawn to report Lucas missing. Vivian stepped back out into the freezing night air, and Rachel quietly closed the heavy side door, locking the deadbolt behind her. The house plunged back into total silence. Rachel stood in the hallway for a moment, letting out a long breath of relief. She turned and began walking back toward the staircase, her bare feet padding softly against the hardwood floor. I remained frozen in the shadows, waiting for her to go back upstairs, so I could finally slip out the laundry room window and get this massive payload of evidence back to Isaiah's basement. I remained frozen in the shadows behind the heavy office door. My right hand gripped the tiny digital audio recorder pinned to my jacket collar. I had it. I had the absolute, undeniable proof of their entire criminal conspiracy. The cloned router data safely tucked into my pocket proved the erratic text messages were completely fabricated. The pristine audio recording I just captured proved interstate wire fraud and the intentional chemical poisoning of my own son. For a brief, fleeting second, a profound sense of victory washed over me. I had successfully secured the very weapons we needed to destroy Vivian and Rachel in a federal courtroom. I waited silently in the dark until Rachel reached the top of the wooden staircase and turned the corner toward the master bedroom. Once I heard the soft click of her bedroom door closing, I stepped out of the office and began moving rapidly down the hallway toward the laundry room. I needed to slip back out the narrow window and vanish into the night before she realized her husband was gone. But as I reached the edge of the kitchen, the absolute silence of the house was violently shattered. A piercing, hysterical scream echoed from the second floor. It was not a scream of genuine terror. It was a perfectly calculated theatrical shriek designed to carry as much dramatic weight as humanly possible. I froze dead in my tracks. Rachel had not gone back to sleep. She had gone directly to check on Lily. I heard her heavy footsteps sprint frantically down the upstairs hallway. She threw open the door to my granddaughter's bedroom and began screaming Lucas's name at the top of her lungs. Then, I heard the distinct sound of a cell phone being dialed on speakerphone. A moment later, the calm, authoritative voice of a 911 emergency dispatcher echoed down the open stairwell. Rachel did not simply ask for help. She launched immediately into a vicious, premeditated script. She began sobbing hysterically into the phone, her voice shaking with manufactured terror. She told the dispatcher that her husband and her 5-year-old daughter were missing from their beds. But she did not stop there. She deliberately escalated the situation to a lethal tactical level. She sobbed into the receiver that my son was suffering from severe drug-induced psychosis. She claimed he had been acting violently and erratically all week due to a massive opioid addiction. Then she dropped the ultimate anchor. She told the dispatcher that I had been at the house earlier that night causing a major disturbance. She specifically named me Harrison Cole. She described me as a deeply paranoid and delusional former bounty hunter who was heavily armed and mentally unstable. She cried out that I had broken into their home, kidnapped her mentally ill husband, and taken her innocent little girl. She begged the police to hurry, claiming she feared for her daughter's life. The dispatcher immediately elevated the call to a Priority 1 active kidnapping. I stood in the dark kitchen, completely paralyzed by the sheer sociopathic brilliance of her maneuver. Vivian had not just instructed Rachel to report them missing. She had instructed Rachel to weaponize my own professional background against me. By branding me as a delusional armed kidnapper and Lucas as a violent drug addict, she had successfully manipulated the local police department into becoming her own personal execution squad. I listened as the dispatcher asked Rachel for my vehicle description. Rachel rattled off the make, model, and license plate of my dark truck without a single second of hesitation. She had memorized it. This entire scenario was a contingency plan Vivian had drilled into her. The dispatcher assured Rachel that multiple armed units were already en route and instructed her to lock herself inside a safe room. Rachel agreed, continuing her flawless performance of the weeping, terrified mother. The sheer malice radiating from the second floor made my blood boil. I wanted to march up those stairs and play the recording of her confessing to poisoning my son right into the phone for the dispatcher to hear. But my logical mind took absolute control. If I confronted her now, the police would arrive to find an armed man standing over a sobbing woman. The audio recording would be completely irrelevant in the heat of a tactical police breach. I would be shot dead on the spot. I turned away from the staircase and sprinted silently toward the laundry room. I squeezed through the narrow open window just as the distant wail of police sirens began to echo through the cold, suburban night air. I dropped onto the freezing grass outside the laundry room and immediately broke into a hard sprint. I did not care about the motion sensor security lights anymore. I needed to clear the immediate perimeter before the first patrol cars locked down the subdivision. I crossed the backyard and vaulted over the 6-foot wooden privacy fence, landing heavily in the dense brush of the greenbelt. My heavy boots tore through the dry winter foliage as I pushed my 64-year-old body to its absolute physical limits. Behind me, I could hear the aggressive screech of tires as multiple police cruisers converged on my son's street. The flashing red and blue strobe lights painted the tops of the tall oak trees, creating a chaotic kaleidoscope of color in the dark sky. I did not stop running until I reached the adjacent neighborhood where I had parked my truck. I climbed into the driver's seat, my lungs burning and my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I shoved the key into the ignition, but I did not turn the headlights on. I pulled away from the curb, relying entirely on the ambient glow of the streetlights to navigate out of the residential area. I merged onto the secondary access road, heading back toward Isaiah's house on the south side of the city. I was officially a fugitive. For 3 decades, I was the man hunting down dangerous criminals who ran from the law. Now I was the one hiding in the shadows, desperately avoiding the sweeping headlights of passing patrol cars. As I approached the entrance ramp to the interstate highway, I looked up at the massive electronic traffic sign suspended over the road. The digital display was flashing with bright amber text. It was an active amber alert for my 5-year-old granddaughter, Lily. But it did not stop there. Below the amber alert, the sign flashed a secondary warning. It was a regional silver alert explicitly listing my name, my age, and a dire warning to the entire public. Armed and dangerous. Do not approach. Call 911 immediately. Seeing my own name glowing in the night sky above the highway felt like a physical blow to the stomach. Vivian had successfully weaponized the entire state infrastructure against us. The local police, the highway patrol, and every single citizen with a cell phone were now actively hunting me. My first instinct was to drive straight to the nearest Federal Bureau of Investigation field office and drop the cloned router drive and the audio recording on the front desk. But I quickly realized how incredibly flawed that plan was. Federal investigations take weeks or even months to initiate. They require subpoenas, chain of custody verifications, and endless bureaucratic reviews. We did not have weeks. We had less than 5 hours before the family court judge signed the permanent conservatorship order at 9 o'clock this morning. If I surrendered to local law enforcement right now, trying to explain the massive corporate conspiracy, they would simply lock me in a holding cell and hand Lucas over to the psychiatric ward. The forged pharmacy logs and the corrupted drug tests were already completely logged in the police database. To any standard patrol officer or local detective, Lucas looked like a violently unstable drug addict, and I looked like a deranged, heavily armed kidnapper trying to steal a child. Vivian had orchestrated a perfect, impenetrable legal fortress. We were completely trapped outside the system with the entire weight of the law crashing down on us. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and took the dark back roads all the way to Isaiah's house. The stakes had just escalated to a terrifying new level. I had to get back to the basement. I had to synchronize the router data with the audio confession, and we had to construct a flawless, undeniable federal trap before the sun came up. We could not go to the police. We had to bring the federal hammer directly into the courtroom. I made it back to Isaiah's house just before 4 in the morning. I parked my truck inside his detached cinder-block garage, pulling the heavy steel door shut behind me to completely conceal the vehicle from the street. When I walked down the wooden stairs into the basement, the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Lucas was sitting on the edge of the small cot, holding his head in his hands. Isaiah was standing at his massive command station, his eyes locked on the local police scanner. The radio traffic was absolute chaos. The regional dispatch was broadcasting my physical description, my license plate, and a direct warning to all patrol units that I was considered armed and highly dangerous. They had successfully painted a massive target on my back and turned the entire city police force into Vivian's personal hunting dogs. I walked over to the stainless steel workbench and placed the black extraction drive on the table. Isaiah looked at the tiny device and then looked up at me, a fierce glint of approval in his eyes. I told him I got everything we needed. I told him I pulled the entire digital history off their home network router and captured a pristine audio recording of my ex-wife and my daughter-in-law confessing to the entire conspiracy. Lucas lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes staring at me in total disbelief. He asked what I meant by a confession. I reached up and unclipped the tiny digital recorder from my collar. I connected it directly to Isaiah's isolated offline server. I told Lucas that what he was about to hear was going to completely destroy him, but he needed to listen to every single word so he could understand exactly what we were fighting against. Isaiah routed the audio file through the heavy studio monitors in the basement. The crisp sound of Rachel and Vivian whispering in the dark hallway filled the underground room. Lucas sat perfectly still as he listened to the mother of his child complain about the profound stress of calculating the precise trace amounts of amphetamines needed to poison his morning coffee. He listened to his own wife admit to risking his life just so he would fail his mandatory hospital drug panels. He listened to Vivian assure Rachel that the money for her multi-million-dollar luxury condo would be wired as soon as the judge signed away his freedom. When the recording finally finished, the silence in the basement was absolutely devastating. Lucas did not scream. He did not cry. He just stared at the concrete wall, the final illusions of his marriage and his family shattering into a million jagged pieces. The betrayal was so profound and so deeply calculated that it completely bypassed his grief and ignited something else entirely. He was a pediatric trauma nurse. He spent his entire life saving people, and the woman sleeping in his bed had been slowly, biochemically murdering him. He looked at me, his jaw clenched tight, his hands curling into tight fists. He told me he wanted to burn their entire world to the ground. I placed my hand firmly on his shoulder. I told him that was exactly what we were going to do. For 30 years, I tracked down men who thought they could outrun the consequences of their violent actions. A good skip tracer knows that you can only run for so long before you eventually exhaust your resources and get caught. But a great skip tracer does not just run forever. A great skip tracer pivots completely from defense to offense and sets a massive steel trap right in the path of the pursuing predator. We had the digital router logs to prove that the erratic text messages were completely spoofed by Vanguard Executive Solutions. We had the audio proof of the physical poisoning and the extortion. But to bypass the corrupt local family court and force a massive federal hammer to drop, we needed to follow the money. We needed undeniable financial documentation proving that Vivian used interstate wire transfers to compensate Rachel for the medical tampering. I looked at Isaiah and asked if he could locate the specific offshore accounts Vivian mentioned on the tape. Isaiah cracked his knuckles and sat down in his heavy leather chair, leaning close to the glowing screens. He stated that Vivian was a deeply paranoid corporate executive. She would never wire dirty money directly from her corporate security firm into a standard checking account held by a hospital nurse. She would have set up a secondary ghost account for Rachel using a fabricated corporate entity to shield the massive transaction from the Internal Revenue Service. To find that ghost account, Isaiah needed to start at the absolute source of Rachel's legitimate income. He needed to breach the human resources database of the pediatric hospital where Rachel and Lucas both worked. Isaiah's fingers began to fly across the illuminated mechanical keyboard. He explained his process as lines of green and white code cascaded down the main monitor. He was not going to execute a brute force attack against the hospital mainframe because that would instantly trigger federal medical privacy alarms. Instead, he was going to use a highly sophisticated digital backdoor. He targeted the third-party payroll processing vendor the hospital used to manage their direct employee deposits. Because Isaiah spent decades working in emergency dispatch management, he knew exactly how these municipal and medical vendor systems communicated with each other. He initiated a spoofed administrative credential request, bouncing his connection through 3 separate virtual private networks to completely mask our physical location in the basement. It took him exactly 12 agonizing minutes to bypass the secondary firewall. He successfully gained read-only access to the massive employee payroll directory. He quickly isolated Rachel's personnel file and opened her financial routing history. On the surface, everything looked entirely normal. Her bi-weekly nursing salary was being deposited directly into the joint checking account she shared with my son. But Isaiah did not stop at the primary deposit page. In the world of forensic data recovery, the truth is always buried underneath the surface. He ran a deep diagnostic script to search for any secondary or hidden routing numbers attached to her Social Security profile. Less than a minute later, a hidden string of alphanumeric data popped up on the screen. Rachel had quietly authorized a secondary micro-deposit link precisely 3 weeks ago. That was the exact same week she began dropping the amphetamines into Lucas's coffee. Isaiah highlighted the secondary routing number. He ran it through an international banking registry database he maintained from his private cybersecurity consulting work. The routing number did not belong to a local commercial bank. It traced directly to an offshore holding company registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Horizon Blue Properties. It was a classic corporate shell structure used specifically to launder massive real estate transactions and hide illicit funds. Isaiah then executed a highly aggressive packet-sniffing protocol targeting that specific shell company. He was actively looking for any inbound financial traffic originating from the United States within the last 48 hours. The main monitor suddenly flashed bright red. He had found the transactional ledger. He pulled the digital records up on the massive screen so Lucas and I could see them. There it was in absolute, undeniable black and white. 2 days ago, Vanguard Executive Solutions had initiated a massive corporate escrow transfer of $2.5 million directly into the Horizon Blue Properties offshore account. The funds were locked in a specialized holding pattern coded to release the moment a specific digital signature was authorized by Vivian. The financial loop was perfectly closed. Vivian was using her immense corporate wealth to fund an offshore shell company, which was directly linked to Rachel's personal hospital payroll profile. I leaned over the stainless steel workbench, staring hard at the glowing numbers. This was the ultimate silver bullet we had been digging for. We did not just have a domestic dispute or a local custody battle anymore. We had hard documented evidence of a multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy. By using digital bank networks to facilitate the payment for poisoning a registered medical professional, Vivian and Rachel had crossed the threshold into massive federal crimes. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice would absolutely tear them to pieces for this. But we still had one massive hurdle standing directly in our way. We could not just email this data to a generic police tip line and hope for the best. The corrupted local judge was scheduled to sign the permanent conservatorship order at 9 o'clock this morning. If that order went through, Lucas would be instantly locked in a psychiatric ward, and Vivian would completely drain his $2 million trust fund before the federal authorities even opened our email. I looked at the digital clock on the cinderblock wall. It was exactly 5:30 in the morning. We had 3.5 hours until the local family courthouse opened its heavy doors. We had the weapon, but we desperately needed a delivery mechanism. We needed to guarantee that Vivian, the corrupt local judge, and the entire family court system were forced to face this undeniable evidence publicly in a setting they could not manipulate or control. I turned to Isaiah and Lucas. I told them we were not going to hide in this dark basement and wait for the tactical police units to kick the door down. I told them we were going to take all of this evidence walk straight through the front doors of that courthouse and shove it directly down their throats. The digital clock in Isaiah's basement ticked relentlessly towards 6 in the morning. We had the smoking gun, but having the evidence and knowing how to weaponize it are two entirely different things. I paced the length of the concrete floor, my mind racing through the terrifying reality of our immediate situation. If we took this extraction drive and the audio recording to the local police precinct right now, we would be walking directly into Vivian's trap. The local police were currently hunting me under an active silver alert. The moment I walked through those glass doors, I would be thrown face down onto the linoleum, handcuffed and stripped of all my personal belongings. The extraction drive would be tossed into a plastic evidence bag and logged into a massive bureaucratic backlog. It would sit in a dark locker for weeks before a detective ever got around to plugging it in. And by the time they realized we were telling the truth, Lucas would already be locked inside a locked psychiatric ward, heavily medicated and completely stripped of his parental rights. Going directly to the family court was just as suicidal. Vivian had specifically chosen a local judge known for his deep ties to corporate campaign donations. Family court is notoriously insular and driven by initial emergency filings. When Vivian's high-priced attorneys presented the forged drug tests and the fabricated erratic text messages, the judge would immediately grant the ex parte emergency conservatorship. If I tried to stand up in that courtroom and play a covert audio recording, the judge would dismiss it instantly as inadmissible hearsay obtained illegally by an armed fugitive. He would hold me in contempt of court and order the bailiffs to draw their weapons. We were completely boxed in by the local jurisdiction. Vivian had bought the battlefield and she owned all the referees. I stopped pacing and looked at the heavy Faraday cage sitting on Isaiah's workbench. I thought about my 30 years hunting violent fugitives across state lines. In my line of work, you quickly learn the massive structural flaws of the American justice system. Local jurisdictions are easily corrupted. County judges can be bought. Local police departments can be manipulated by false reports and wealthy corporate security firms. But the federal government is an entirely different beast. Federal agencies do not care about local politics. They do not care about county judges. When the federal machine wakes up, it consumes everything in its path with absolute ruthless efficiency. I needed to bypass the corrupt local family court completely and trigger a massive federal jurisdictional override. I turned to Isaiah and asked him to pull up the exact wording of Title 18, United States Code, Section 1343. Isaiah's fingers flew across the keyboard, and the legal text filled the massive monitor. It was the federal statute for interstate wire fraud. I pointed to the glowing text and explained my strategy to Lucas. I told him we were no longer fighting a custody battle or a mental health petition. We were fighting a massive corporate crime. Vivian did not just hand Rachel an envelope of dirty cash in a dark alley. She used her massive corporate security firm to authorize an electronic transfer of $2.5 million from a domestic escrow account into an offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. That money was then digitally routed into a secondary micro-deposit account tied directly to Rachel's personal payroll file. The moment those digital funds crossed an international or state border to facilitate a criminal act, Vivian triggered a mandatory federal jurisdiction, but wire fraud alone was a white-collar crime. It was a slow-moving bureaucratic process. We needed something highly violent and immediately actionable to force the federal authorities to kick down the doors of that courthouse this morning. I looked at Lucas, who was staring intently at the legal text on the screen. I asked him to clarify the exact nature of the amphetamines Rachel had been slipping into his coffee. I asked him if she had stolen them from the hospital pharmacy or if she had forged a prescription. Lucas shook his head, his voice cold and steady. He explained that Rachel did not need to steal them from the hospital because she had a licensed private prescription for attention deficit disorder. But she was a registered pediatric trauma nurse working for a federally funded medical institution. I felt a massive surge of triumph rush through my chest. That was the ultimate kill shot. I told Isaiah to pull up the Federal Anti-Tampering Act and the strict regulations of the Drug Enforcement Administration regarding Schedule II narcotics. I explained the absolute brilliance of the legal snare we were about to set. Rachel was not just a disgruntled wife trying to drug her husband. She was a state-licensed registered nurse holding specialized medical credentials. She intentionally altered and administered a highly regulated Schedule II federally controlled substance to cause deliberate bodily harm and manipulate a mandated medical drug panel. Furthermore, she did this while accepting a $2.5 million wire transfer from a corporate entity. By legally defining her actions as federal medical tampering committed for massive financial gain, we instantly elevated this from a local domestic dispute into a high-priority federal criminal conspiracy. The Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation hold absolute supreme jurisdiction over crimes involving licensed medical professionals weaponizing highly regulated federal narcotics across state lines. If we presented this specific combination of evidence to the right federal magistrate, the local family court judge would be completely stripped of his legal authority. The local police would have to immediately stand down. Vivian's entire legal strategy would instantly evaporate under the crushing weight of a federal racketeering investigation. I looked at Isaiah and told him we needed to package the data. We could not just walk into the courthouse with a tiny black drive and ask someone to plug it in. We needed to create a devastating physical dossier that no judge or federal agent could possibly ignore. Isaiah immediately went to work. He connected his secure offline server to a heavy-duty laser printer in the corner of the basement. He began printing out the massive spreadsheets of the cloned router logs, highlighting the exact digital timestamps proving the erratic text messages were spoofed by Vanguard Executive Solutions. Next, he printed the irrefutable financial ledgers showing the $2.5 million wire transfer flowing from Vivian's corporate accounts into Rachel's hidden offshore shell company. Then Isaiah did something absolutely brilliant. He ran the pristine audio recording of their dark hallway confession through a specialized forensic transcription software. The printer spit out 10 crisp pages of highly detailed dialogue explicitly documenting Rachel's admission to the physical poisoning and Vivian's promise of the luxury condo. Isaiah stamped the top of every single page with an official forensic data authentication seal, utilizing his active credentials as a certified private cybersecurity investigator. This proved the audio had not been artificially generated or digitally altered in any way. It was completely raw, legally admissible evidence. Lucas stood by the printer, gathering the warm sheets of paper and placing them carefully into a thick manila folder. I watched my son transform right in front of my eyes. The terrified, exhausted victim who had been huddled on the floorboards of my truck just a few hours ago was completely gone. He was replacing his grief with pure, calculated stoicism. He was methodically organizing the very documents that would send his own mother and his own wife to a federal penitentiary for the next decade. He was finally learning the hardest lesson a father can ever teach. Sometimes the only way to protect the innocent is to become absolutely merciless toward the guilty. I checked my sidearm, making sure the safety was engaged, and holstered it beneath my heavy jacket. I grabbed a thick black marker and wrote exactly 3 words across the front of the manila folder. Federal Criminal Conspiracy. The trap was fully constructed. The bait was set. The steel jaws were primed and ready to snap shut. We had less than 2 hours to drive into the heart of the city and walk directly into a courthouse swarming with armed police officers looking for my face. It was a massive calculated risk that could easily end with me being shot dead on the courthouse steps. But as I looked at Lucas holding that thick folder of evidence, I knew I would gladly take a bullet to ensure Vivian lost absolutely everything. We walked up the basement stairs, leaving the safety of the underground fortress, and stepped out into the freezing morning air. The sun was just beginning to rise over the city, illuminating the battlefield where we would make our final stand. We stepped out of the heavy steel door of Isaiah's basement and into the freezing early morning air. The sun was just beginning to break over the eastern horizon, casting long gray shadows across the quiet suburban street. Lucas was clutching the thick manila folder against his chest like it was a physical shield. Inside that folder was the absolute, undeniable proof of a multi-million-dollar federal criminal conspiracy orchestrated by his own mother and his own wife. We had the weapon to completely destroy their lives and save my granddaughter. But as we walked toward Isaiah's unassuming dark gray sedan, I knew we were facing a massive tactical problem. Having the evidence meant absolutely nothing if we were dead before we could present it to a judge. I stopped at the trunk of the car and looked at my son and my brother-in-law. I explained the brutal reality of the battlefield we were about to enter. The local family courthouse was located right in the middle of the downtown municipal district. By now, Vivian would have deployed her entire Vanguard Executive Solutions security force to establish a covert perimeter around the building. They would be sitting in unmarked vehicles, watching every single access road, every parking garage, and every pedestrian walkway. Furthermore, the local police were actively hunting my truck and my face under a statewide silver alert. If we simply drove up to the front steps of the courthouse, Vivian's contractors would intercept us before we even put the car in park. They would not hesitate to drag us into the back of a van and make us disappear. We desperately needed a massive diversion to pull her tactical units and the local police dragnet completely away from the judicial district. I reached into the deep tactical pocket of my heavy winter jacket and pulled out a small, sterile, prepaid cell phone. It was a cheap plastic burner device I had purchased over a year ago with cash and never once turned on. I explained to Lucas that Vivian was a billionaire corporate security chief. She had access to military-grade cellular site simulators commonly known as stingrays. These highly restricted devices mimic legitimate cellular towers, forcing all mobile phones in the immediate area to connect to them and reveal their exact physical locations. I knew for an absolute fact that Vivian had logged the International Mobile Equipment Identity number of every single electronic device I had ever owned. Even though this burner phone had never been used, I had kept it in the glove box of my truck for months. Her surveillance teams would have sniffed its unique signature during their routine monitoring of my vehicle. If this phone suddenly connected to the municipal cellular grid, her digital tracking software would instantly light up with a massive red warning. I climbed into the passenger seat of Isaiah's sedan and instructed him to drive toward the northern edge of the downtown financial district. We needed to be at least 4 miles away from the family courthouse. Isaiah navigated the empty morning streets with the calm precision of a man who had driven emergency vehicles his entire life. He pulled the sedan into a narrow brick alleyway directly behind a massive 50-story luxury hotel. This specific hotel was a towering fortress of glass and steel, with over 1,000 individual guest rooms, massive underground parking structures, and dozens of service elevators. It was the absolute worst nightmare for any tactical clearing team. I looked at the digital clock on the dashboard. It was exactly 7:45 in the morning. I held the cheap plastic burner phone in my palm, keeping my thumb resting over the power button. I turned to Lucas in the back seat and explained the precise mechanics of the trap I was about to spring. I told him I was going to power the device on for exactly 8 seconds. In the world of digital skip tracing, 8 seconds is the absolute golden window. It is just enough time for the phone to boot up, send a handshake signal to the nearest cellular tower, and register its physical coordinates on the global system for mobile communications network. But 8 seconds is completely insufficient for a mobile surveillance team to triangulate the exact floor or the specific room inside a massive concrete structure. I took a deep breath and pressed the power button. The cheap liquid crystal display illuminated the dark cabin of the sedan with a harsh white glow. I started counting out loud. 1, 2. The screen displayed a generic carrier logo. 3, 4. The internal antenna began searching for a signal. 5, 6. The signal bars jumped from 0 to 4, indicating a solid connection to the macro cell tower mounted on the roof of the hotel. 7, 8. I immediately held down the power button and simultaneously ripped the plastic back cover off the device, yanking the lithium-ion battery completely out of its housing. The screen went dead black. The signal was permanently severed. I looked at Isaiah and nodded. He immediately threw the sedan into reverse and backed rapidly out of the alleyway, merging smoothly into the early morning commuter traffic. We were leaving the northern financial district entirely and heading south toward the courthouse. I explained to Lucas what was happening at that exact second inside Vivian's command center. Her automated tracking software had just registered a massive critical alert. It showed my burner phone appearing right in the middle of a massive luxury hotel and then instantly vanishing off the grid. Vivian would immediately assume we had abandoned my truck and secured a room inside the hotel to hide with Lily until the police dragnet cooled down. Because she was a control freak who did not trust the local police to do her dirty work, she would instantly redirect every single available Vanguard contractor to that hotel. She would order her men to lock down the lobbies, the exits, and the service elevators. She would force her teams to begin a massive illegal room-by-room search, tying up her entire security apparatus for hours. We had successfully created a ghost. The bait was set perfectly. The physical path to the courthouse was now completely wide open. Isaiah turned up the volume on the encrypted digital police scanner mounted below his dashboard. For 5 minutes, the radio traffic was standard morning chatter. Then suddenly, the dispatcher broadcast a priority override. Multiple civilian calls were reporting armed men in tactical gear storming the lobby of the Northern Luxury Hotel. The local police were immediately scrambling their own rapid response units to converge on the hotel to intercept what they believed was an active hostage situation. I let out a heavy breath of relief. The strategy had worked flawlessly. Vivian's private army and the local police force were now completely entangled in a massive chaotic standoff 4 miles away from our actual target. The resolution of our tactical problem was absolute. The federal dossier was sitting securely on Lucas's lap, and we had a completely clear straight shot to the front steps of the family court building. But I had underestimated the sheer sociopathic brilliance of my ex-wife. Vivian was not just a tactical commander who relied solely on armed men. She was a master manipulator of public perception and institutional power. As we drove closer to the judicial district, the police scanner suddenly crackled with a completely different kind of emergency alert. It was not a tactical redeployment. It was a massive city-wide broadcast originating directly from the chief of police. Isaiah's face went completely rigid. He reached over and activated the digital infotainment screen on his dashboard, switching the input from the radio to the live feed of the local morning news broadcast. The screen flickered to life, displaying the front steps of the family courthouse. Standing right behind a podium surrounded by dozens of flashing cameras and news reporters was Vivian. She was not wearing her usual sharp corporate attire. She was wearing a simple dark dress, her hair slightly disheveled, looking every bit the part of a terrified, devastated grandmother. Next to her stood Rachel, sobbing uncontrollably into a tissue, playing the role of the broken mother to absolute perfection. The news anchor's voiceover announced that the family of the missing pediatric nurse and his 5-year-old daughter were holding an emergency press conference. We listened in absolute horrified silence as Vivian stepped up to the microphones. She did not just spin a narrative, she completely weaponized the media. She looked directly into the camera lenses with tears streaming down her face and begged the public for help. She stated that her mentally unstable ex-husband, Harrison Cole, a former bounty hunter with a history of extreme violence, had suffered a severe psychotic break. She claimed I had kidnapped her drug-addicted son and her innocent granddaughter, and that I was heavily armed and completely unpredictable. She told the millions of people watching the morning news that I had explicitly threatened to end all of our lives rather than surrender to the authorities. It was a flawless, terrifying performance designed to generate maximum public hysteria. But Vivian was not just putting on a show for the cameras. She was using the intense media pressure to force the hand of the corrupt local judge. The news anchor broke into the broadcast with a breaking news update. Because of the extreme public panic and the immediate perceived threat to a child, the family court judge had taken unprecedented emergency action. He had bypassed all standard legal waiting periods. The judge had officially moved the conservatorship hearing to exactly 9 o'clock this morning, and he was conducting it entirely in absentia. That meant Lucas did not even need to be physically present in the courtroom for the judge to permanently strip away his medical license, his parental rights, and his $2 million trust fund. Vivian had successfully used the media to accelerate the legal execution. Then the final devastating blow landed. The police scanner erupted with a new highest-level tactical alert. Because of Vivian's public televised statements claiming I was actively threatening to murder my own family, the chief of police had elevated my status. They upgraded the silver alert to a lethal force authorized warrant, a shoot on sight directive. The dispatcher explicitly warned all patrol officers and courthouse security personnel that Harrison Cole was considered an active lethal threat to a child. Any law enforcement officer who encountered me was legally authorized to use immediate deadly force without warning. The digital clock on the dashboard clicked to 8:45 in the morning. We were exactly 4 blocks away from the courthouse. The clock had entirely run out. The brilliant federal trap we had spent the entire night building in the basement was completely useless if we could not physically get it into the hands of a federal magistrate inside that building. But walking up the front steps of that courthouse now was absolute suicide. Every single security guard, bailiff, and police officer in that building had their hands resting on their holsters waiting for my face to appear. If I walked through those metal detectors, they would not ask me for evidence. They would draw their weapons and fire instantly. Lucas stared at the glowing dashboard screen, his face completely drained of color. He looked at me, his voice trembling with sheer terror, begging me to turn the car around, claiming that the money and the rights were not worth me getting killed. But as I looked at the thick manila folder in his hands, I knew there was absolutely no turning back. We were going to walk straight into the firing squad. Isaiah navigated the sedan through the morning traffic. Every time a police cruiser flew past us toward the decoy hotel, my stomach twisted into a tight knot. Isaiah dropped us off at the rear delivery entrance of the family court building. Because Vivian had successfully redirected her entire private security force and the local police rapid response units to the fake hostage situation 4 miles away, the massive tactical perimeter around the courthouse was completely gone. There were only a few standard municipal security guards monitoring the metal detectors inside the lobby. I took my legally registered 9mm sidearm from my holster and handed it to Isaiah. I told him to stay in the car, keep the engine running, and wait for my signal. I was not going to give the police any excuse to shoot me for carrying a weapon into a municipal building. Lucas and I walked up the concrete loading ramp and slipped through the heavy glass doors. The lobby was entirely empty. We walked straight through the metal detectors. The alarms stayed completely silent. We took the heavy brass elevator up to the 3rd floor. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but my hands were completely steady. We stepped off the elevator and stood quietly in the shadowed alcove just outside courtroom 3. The heavy wooden double doors were slightly ajar, allowing us to hear everything happening inside. I looked at the digital clock mounted on the marble wall. It was exactly 8:55 in the morning. We were exactly 5 minutes away from total legal annihilation. I peeked through the narrow gap between the wooden doors. The courtroom was an absolute circus of corruption and media manipulation. Vivian had somehow managed to pull enough political strings to get a local news crew inside the private family court, allowing the press to set up large television cameras right behind the wooden gallery barricade. She wanted Lucas destroyed publicly. She wanted his professional medical reputation completely obliterated on the morning news, so he could never rebuild his life. Vivian was sitting at the plaintiff's table wearing a sharp charcoal suit, her posture absolutely perfect, her face projecting a flawless mask of profound maternal tragedy. Her high-priced corporate lawyers were hovering around her, arranging thick stacks of fabricated medical evaluations, forged pharmacy records, and fake psychiatric reports. At the table right next to Vivian sat Rachel. My treacherous daughter-in-law was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She was slumped over the heavy wooden table, clutching a crumpled tissue, weeping hysterically for the television cameras. She looked exactly like a devastated young mother, terrified for her life, mourning the tragic loss of her husband to a violent, uncontrollable drug addiction. But I knew the absolute truth. I knew she was crying tears of pure greed, counting the seconds, until she received the deed to a $2.5 million luxury condo overlooking the city. Sitting high above them on the polished mahogany bench was the local family court judge. He was a stern-looking man with silver hair who had clearly already made up his mind before he even put on his black judicial robe. He looked down at the massive stacks of paper and expressed his deep sorrow over the tragic circumstances presented to the court. He stated for the official audio record that due to the extreme physical danger Lucas supposedly posed to the community and the active police manhunt for my arrest, he was waiving all standard legal waiting periods. The judge reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy gold pen. He announced to the packed courtroom that he had reviewed the evidence and was fully prepared to sign the emergency ex parte order. He stated clearly into his microphone that he was granting Vivian absolute permanent conservatorship over Lucas Cole, his medical rights, his financial assets, and his 5-year-old daughter, Lily. The local reporters zoomed their cameras in to capture the final moment. The judge raised his wooden gavel high into the air, preparing to strike the sounding block to make the ruling official and seal my son's fate forever. I looked at Lucas. He looked back at me, his face completely devoid of fear. The terrified victim I had rescued last night was dead. He tightened his grip on the thick manila folder containing the massive federal criminal dossier. I reached out and placed both of my hands flat against the heavy wooden double doors. I did not knock. I did not ask the bailiffs for permission to enter the judicial chamber. I shoved the doors open with a massive surge of physical force, putting the entire weight of my body into the movement. The heavy wood slammed violently against the marble walls, echoing like a massive gunshot through the quiet courtroom. Every single head in the room snapped backward in absolute shock. The local news reporters gasped out loud, stepping away from their camera tripods. The armed bailiffs instantly dropped their hands to their utility belts, unlatching the safety straps on their holsters, ready to draw their weapons. But they froze completely in their tracks, confused by what they were seeing. Lucas and I walked shoulder to shoulder, right down the center aisle of the courtroom. We did not run. We did not shout or make any sudden aggressive movements. We walked with the slow, terrifying precision of men who held absolute power over the entire room. My hands were completely empty and raised slightly, showing the judge and the police officers that I was entirely unarmed. I was not the delusional armed kidnapper Vivian had described on television. The only weapon in the entire room was the single manila folder clutched tightly in my own son's right hand. We stopped exactly 3 feet away from Vivian's table and stared directly up at the judge. The lion had invited us into its den, but it had no idea we brought the cage. The heavy silence in the courtroom lasted for exactly 3 seconds before Vivian completely shattered it. For a fraction of a second, when she first saw us standing in the center aisle, her perfect mask of maternal sorrow slipped. Her eyes widened with genuine panic because she knew her tactical perimeter had failed. But Vivian was a master of psychological warfare. Before the local news cameras could even focus on her face, she instantly pivoted. She leaped out of her heavy mahogany chair and let out a piercing theatrical scream. She pointed a violently trembling finger directly at my chest and began shouting orders not to her lawyers, but to the armed bailiffs standing near the judge. She screamed that I was a wanted federal fugitive. She cried out that there was an active silver alert for my arrest, and that I was heavily armed and extremely dangerous. She begged the bailiffs to draw their weapons and protect the courtroom, claiming I had suffered a total psychotic break and was holding her son hostage. The two municipal bailiffs immediately stepped forward, unsnapping their holsters and resting their hands firmly on the grips of their service weapons. The local reporters scrambled backward, knocking over a chair in their desperate attempt to get out of the line of fire. The judge stood up behind his bench, his face pale, demanding that I get down on the floor and put my hands behind my head. But I did not move a single muscle. I kept my hands raised clearly, showing I was completely empty-handed. I did not yell back at Vivian, and I did not argue with the judge. I knew that any sudden movement or raised voice would instantly validate the exact narrative Vivian was trying to sell. I just stood there shoulder to shoulder with my son, staring straight ahead with absolute stoic calm. When Vivian realized the bailiffs were hesitating because I was not acting like a violent, deranged shooter, she seamlessly shifted her tactic. She put on an absolute masterclass of gaslighting. She grabbed the edge of the plaintiff's table, her knuckles turning white, and began sobbing heavily. She looked directly up at the judge and lowered her voice to a desperate, pleading tone. She told the judge that my terrifying calmness was the ultimate proof of my psychopathy. She claimed that for 30 years I had been a violent bounty hunter who solved every family dispute with a gun and intimidation. She spun a brilliant web of lies, stating that I had broken into their home in the middle of the night, kidnapped Lucas at gunpoint, and brainwashed him. She told the entire courtroom that I was using my own son as a human shield to avoid going to federal prison. She pointed at Lucas and cried out that he was not in his right mind. She swore to the judge that Lucas was suffering from severe opioid withdrawal right at this very moment, and that I was exploiting his terrible sickness to maintain control over him. Every single word out of her mouth was perfectly calculated to manipulate the legal system and the media simultaneously. She was building an impenetrable wall of plausible deniability. If Lucas tried to speak, she had already framed him as a delusional drug addict. If I tried to speak, she had already framed me as a dangerous kidnapper. Then Rachel decided it was time to play her specific role in this demonic theater. My treacherous daughter-in-law stood up from her chair, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. She ignored me completely and focused her entire attack directly on Lucas. She walked around the heavy wooden table, taking 2 slow steps toward us, her hands clasped together in a posture of desperate prayer. She looked at the man she had been actively poisoning for 3 weeks and delivered a performance that made my blood run absolutely cold. Rachel sobbed his name, begging him to step away from me. She told him that she loved him more than anything in the world, and that she just wanted her husband back. She cried out that he was very sick and that his addiction was destroying their beautiful family. She pleaded with him to look at what he was doing to their life. She promised him that if he just surrendered right now and agreed to go to a secure rehabilitation facility, she would be waiting for him when he got out. She swore she would never give up on him. The sheer sociopathic audacity of her lies was staggering. She was standing in front of local television cameras begging a man to get help for a drug addiction that she had artificially created by slipping amphetamines into his morning coffee. She was promising him eternal love while her offshore bank account was waiting for a $2.5 million wire transfer to buy her a luxury divorce condo. I glanced sideways at Lucas. A few hours ago, this level of psychological manipulation would have completely broken him. But he had listened to the raw audio recording in the basement. He had heard his wife complain about the stress of calculating his lethal dosage. He knew the absolute truth, and that truth had forged his spine into solid steel. He did not flinch. He did not break eye contact with his treacherous wife. He just stood there, holding the thick manila folder completely immune to her toxic tears. The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block, demanding absolute order in his courtroom. He looked down at me with absolute disgust. He had completely bought Vivian's performance. He pointed his finger at me and told me that I had made the worst mistake of my life by walking into his jurisdiction. He commanded the armed bailiffs to approach me immediately and place me under arrest for armed kidnapping and felony endangerment. The bailiffs drew their handcuffs and began walking down the center aisle, their eyes locked onto my chest. Vivian let out a long, shaky breath of relief and slumped back into her chair, throwing a victorious glance toward Rachel. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully trapped me inside the very legal system they controlled. They had absolutely no idea that the trap was about to spring in the exact opposite direction. The two armed municipal bailiffs continued their slow, aggressive march down the center aisle of the courtroom, their hands resting heavily on the black grips of their service weapons. The leather of their duty belts creaked in the tense silence. The local television reporters pressed themselves tightly against the wooden gallery barricades, holding their heavy broadcast cameras up to capture what they believed would be a violent and bloody shootout. Vivian leaned forward in her mahogany chair, her eyes wide with a mixture of predatory excitement and desperate anticipation. She was waiting for me to make a sudden, aggressive movement. She was waiting for me to shout or reach into my heavy winter jacket so the bailiffs would have the legal justification to draw their weapons and end my life right there on the polished marble floor. But I did not give her the satisfaction. I completely ignored the armed men walking toward me. I did not look at Vivian, and I did not look at my treacherous daughter, in-law Rachel, who was still acting out her pathetic performance of the weeping, broken wife. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the silver-haired family court judge sitting high upon his elevated bench. I raised my voice just enough to carry over the chaotic murmuring of the press and the heavy footsteps of the approaching guards. I projected my words with the absolute commanding authority of a man who held the entire room in the palm of his hand. I addressed the judge directly, telling him to call off his bailiffs immediately. I told him that I was not a deranged kidnapper, and I was not there to argue a petty family law dispute. I stated clearly for the official court record that he had absolutely no legal jurisdiction over the man standing next to me. The judge bristled with indignation, his face flushing bright red with anger at my sheer audacity. He grabbed his wooden gavel and demanded that I surrender to his officers immediately or face additional federal charges for threatening a judicial officer. I did not flinch. I turned slightly and nodded to my son. Lucas stepped forward, moving with a calm, terrifying grace that completely shattered the fabricated narrative of a violently unstable drug addict. He walked directly up to the heavy wooden gate, separating the gallery from the legal tables. He did not look at his mother, and he did not look at his wife. He reached over the wooden gate and placed the massive, thick manila folder directly onto the edge of the judge's elevated bench. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood echoed loudly in the silent room. I stepped up right beside my son and delivered the absolute kill shot. I told the judge loud enough for every single television microphone to pick up the audio that my client Lucas Cole could not be placed under a state conservatorship today, tomorrow, or ever. I announced that Lucas Cole was currently under active federal protection as a primary cooperating witness in a massive interstate wire fraud and domestic terrorism investigation. The entire courtroom froze. The two armed bailiffs stopped dead in their tracks halfway down the aisle, looking up at the judge for confirmation. The judge lowered his gavel, his hand hovering uncertainly in the air. His eyes darted from my calm expression to the thick manila folder resting on his bench. Vivian's perfect posture suddenly collapsed. Her face drained of all color, turning an absolute sickly shade of pale gray. She knew exactly what the words federal protection meant. She knew her corrupt local influence stopped at the municipal county line. But before the judge could even open his mouth to question my authority, the heavy oak double doors at the absolute back of the courtroom swung violently open for the second time that morning. The sound was like a thunderclap. Every single camera lens and every pair of eyes in the room instantly snapped toward the back entrance, A team of 8 heavily armed men and women marched into the courtroom. They were not wearing the standard blue uniforms of the local municipal police. They were wearing dark tactical gear, heavy Kevlar vests, and olive drab windbreakers with the bright yellow letters spelling out Federal Bureau of Investigation and United States Marshals Service printed boldly across their chests. Isaiah had done his job flawlessly. While we were setting the decoy at the hotel, my brother-in-law had reached out to his highest-level contacts within the Federal Emergency Dispatch Network. He had provided them with the encrypted router data and the offshore banking ledgers, triggering an immediate, massive federal override. The lead federal marshal, a tall, broad-shouldered man with absolute cold authority radiating from his eyes, bypassed the local bailiffs entirely. He walked straight up to the judge's bench, pulling a thick stack of authorized federal warrants from his tactical vest. He slapped the warrants down right next to our manila folder. He looked directly at the local family court judge and announced that the United States Department of Justice was officially seizing absolute jurisdiction over this entire courtroom. He ordered the local municipal bailiffs to stand down and secure the perimeter. The power dynamic in the room did not just shift, it completely, violently inverted. The local judge, who had been seconds away from destroying my son's life, suddenly shrank back into his heavy leather chair, realizing he had almost made himself an unwitting accomplice to a massive federal corporate crime. I did not wait for Vivian or Rachel to recover from their shock. I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket and pulled out the tiny digital audio recorder. I walked slowly over to the plaintiff's table, where Vivian and Rachel were sitting, completely paralyzed by the federal presence. I looked directly into one of the local news broadcast cameras, making sure the red recording light was on. Then I placed the digital recorder directly next to the massive courtroom microphone positioned on Vivian's table. I pressed the play button. The crystal-clear audio of their dark hallway conversation flooded the massive room, amplifying through the courtroom's surround sound speakers. The voice of my daughter-in-law echoed off the marble walls, detailing the exact, precise trace amounts of regulated prescription amphetamines she had been intentionally dissolving into my son's morning coffee. The entire gallery gasped in absolute collective horror. The local reporters shoved their microphones closer, desperate to capture every single sickening syllable. Then Vivian's voice boomed through the speakers. Her arrogant, cruel tone filled the room as she promised Rachel the deed to a $2.5 million luxury condo overlooking the city the exact second the judge signed away Lucas's freedom. She explicitly bragged about the offshore wire transfers and the manipulation of the mandatory hospital blood panels. It was an absolute, pristine, legally admissible confession to federal medical tampering and interstate corporate wire fraud playing out live on the local morning news. The cinematic payoff was absolute and utterly devastating. The family court judge frantically opened the manila folder Lucas had placed on his bench. His eyes darted across the printed spreadsheets of the cloned router logs, proving the text messages were entirely spoofed. He flipped the page and saw the irrefutable forensic banking ledgers showing the offshore shell company transaction. He saw the official forensic data authentication seals stamped on every single page by Isaiah's cybersecurity firm. The judge realized instantly that Vivian had used him. She had turned his courtroom into an instrument of attempted murder and corporate theft. The judge grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and struck the sounding block with massive, violent force. He shouted into his microphone that the petition for emergency medical conservatorship was immediately and permanently denied with extreme prejudice. He then looked directly at the lead federal marshal and stated that the floor was entirely theirs. Rachel completely broke down. The sheer reality of the federal hammer crashing down upon her shattered her fabricated weeping wife persona. She scrambled backward, knocking her heavy wooden chair over onto the floor. She looked at the federal marshals advancing toward her and began screaming hysterically. She turned toward Lucas, holding her hands out, begging him to tell them it was all a misunderstanding. She cried out that she was his wife and the mother of his child, pleading with him to stop them. But Lucas just stared at her with absolute dead eyes. The federal marshals grabbed her by the arms, spinning her roughly around and slamming her wrists together. The cold, heavy click of the steel handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed loudly over her pathetic screams. The lead marshal leaned in and read her Miranda rights, informing her she was under arrest for federal medical tampering assault with a deadly biochemical weapon and criminal conspiracy. Vivian, however, did not scream. She was a billionaire corporate executive who believed her immense wealth made her completely untouchable by the laws of ordinary men. She stood up slowly, straightening her sharp charcoal suit. She picked up her expensive designer handbag and looked at her team of high-priced corporate lawyers, completely ignoring the chaos consuming Rachel. Vivian stated in a cold, arrogant voice that she was leaving. She informed the federal agents that she would not be answering any questions without her elite legal counsel present, and that they could expect a massive civil lawsuit for this outrageous public defamation. She turned and attempted to walk right past the tactical federal agents, expecting them to simply step aside and defer to her massive financial power. But the lead federal marshal did not step aside. He shifted his massive frame, completely blocking her path. He looked down at her with a terrifying lack of emotion. He informed Vivian that she was not going anywhere. He grabbed her wrists completely, ignoring her outraged screams about her civil rights, and locked a pair of heavy federal handcuffs onto her. Vivian demanded that her lawyers post her bail immediately. She shouted that she could buy and sell the entire judicial district. The marshal let out a low, dark laugh. He informed Vivian that she could not buy anything ever again. He pulled a secondary document from his tactical vest and shoved it directly into her face. He announced loudly for the entire courtroom and the media cameras to hear that the Department of Justice had officially enacted the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. He told her that every single corporate bank account, every offshore shell company, every piece of real estate, and every single penny she owned was currently frozen under federal RICO statutes. Vanguard Executive Solutions was being immediately liquidated by federal auditors. Her massive private security empire was completely gone. She was absolutely penniless, utterly powerless, and facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Vivian collapsed to her knees on the marble floor, the absolute total ruin of her existence finally registering in her mind. Her arrogant mask dissolved into a hollow, blank stare of pure, unadulterated terror. Lucas walked slowly around the heavy wooden table. He stood directly over the two women who had conspired to murder him, steal his child, and erase his entire life. The local news cameras zoomed in tightly on his face, capturing the profound transformation of a man who had walked through hell and emerged completely unbroken. He looked down at Rachel sobbing violently on the floor, and then he looked down at his mother, kneeling in absolute defeat in her federal handcuffs. The courtroom was dead silent, waiting for him to scream or curse at them. But Lucas did not raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet, terrifying calm of a man who had finally realized his own massive strength. He looked directly into Vivian's terrified eyes. "You thought I was weak. You thought because I spent my life healing people instead of hunting them that I would not know how to fight back in the dark. But you made one massive, fatal miscalculation. You forgot who raised me." I stood next to my son, feeling a profound, overwhelming wave of absolute paternal pride. The war was officially over. We had walked straight into the belly of the beast completely unarmed, and we had burned their entire corrupt empire to the ground. We turned our backs on the wreckage of their lives and walked together back down the center aisle of the courtroom, out into the bright morning sun, where Isaiah and my beautiful granddaughter Lily were waiting for us to finally go home. The swiftness of federal justice is a terrifying thing to witness when you are on the wrong side of the law. The morning news broadcast that Vivian had meticulously orchestrated to destroy my son instantly became the instrument of her absolute public destruction. The local news anchors who had just moments before described me as a violently unstable kidnapper were suddenly forced to walk back every single word live on the air. The television cameras captured the undeniable reality of federal marshals marching a billionaire corporate executive out of the family courthouse in heavy iron handcuffs. The media narrative shifted completely in a matter of minutes. I was no longer the crazy, delusional grandfather. I was the heroic, retired bounty hunter who had just successfully exposed a massive multi-million-dollar medical fraud and corporate extortion ring. Vivian was completely denied bail. The federal magistrate deemed her an extreme flight risk due to her massive offshore wealth and international security connections. During her lengthy federal trial, the pristine audio recording we captured in the dark hallway proved to be the absolute nail in her legal coffin. She was convicted under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act and sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Her entire corporate empire, Vanguard Executive Solutions, was completely liquidated by the federal government to pay massive federal fines and victim restitutions. She lost her penthouse, she lost her armored vehicles, and most importantly, she permanently lost her ability to ever manipulate another human being again. Rachel faced a similarly devastating and absolute fate. The moment the federal indictment was officially unsealed, the state medical board immediately and permanently revoked her pediatric nursing license. She tried desperately to strike a plea deal by offering to completely turn against Vivian in open court. But the federal prosecutors flatly refused her offer because our cloned router data provided all the undeniable proof they required. Rachel was found guilty of federal medical tampering and sentenced to 10 years behind bars. The luxury $2.5 million condo she had been so desperate to secure was seized by the federal government before she ever even got the chance to see the front door. Furthermore, the corrupt local family court judge abruptly resigned from his judicial bench just 2 days later, citing sudden unspecific health issues, thereby barely avoiding a massive internal affairs investigation. The impenetrable legal trap they had spent months building to destroy my son evaporated into nothingness. Lucas was entirely cleared of all fabricated medical charges and immediately granted absolute full legal and physical custody of my beautiful granddaughter Lily. The suffocating nightmare was finally over. The violent storm had passed, leaving behind a crystal-clear sky. 6 months later, the dark, heavy memory of that terrifying Wednesday night felt like it belonged to an entirely different lifetime. It was a warm, sunny Saturday afternoon in late September. We were gathered in the spacious backyard of Isaiah's house, celebrating the absolute peace we had fought so incredibly hard to secure. The smell of burning charcoal and smoked brisket drifted through the warm afternoon air. Isaiah was standing by his massive custom-built steel smoker, wearing a bright apron and laughing loudly as he flipped heavy cuts of meat with a pair of silver tongs. He looked entirely different from the intense cybersecurity expert who had commanded the dark basement 6 months prior. Today, he was just an incredibly happy uncle, surrounded by the family he helped save. I sat back in a comfortable folding lawn chair, holding a cold glass of sweet tea, just watching the beautiful reality unfolding in front of me. Across the green grass, Lily was running happily through the sprinkler, squealing with pure, joyful delight as the cold water splashed against her bright yellow bathing suit. She was completely safe. She was entirely untouched by the massive corporate conspiracy that had almost swallowed her future whole. And standing a few feet away, watching her with a gentle, contented smile, was my son. Lucas looked incredibly healthy. The pale, exhausted ghost who had been slowly biochemically poisoned by his own wife was completely gone. He had returned to his demanding work as a pediatric trauma nurse, saving the lives of innocent children every single day without the heavy, crushing fear of being watched. He had reclaimed his absolute independence and rebuilt his life on a foundation of absolute, solid truth. Lucas walked over to my lawn chair, carrying 2 plates of warm food. He handed me one and sat down in the empty chair beside me. We sat in comfortable, quiet silence for a few long moments, simply watching Lily chase a colorful butterfly across the yard. Then Lucas reached down beside his chair and picked up a large object. It was a brand new heavy-duty tactical nursing backpack. It was exactly like the black nylon bag I had sliced open with a razor blade in his dark kitchen 6 months ago. He placed the heavy bag gently onto my lap. I looked at him a bit confused, my seasoned skip tracer instincts momentarily flaring up. I asked him if he wanted me to sweep this one for military-grade tracking devices, too. Lucas let out a warm, genuine laugh. It was a sound I had not heard from him in years, and it healed a massive, heavy ache in my chest. He shook his head and told me there were no corporate bugs hidden inside this one. He simply asked me to unzip the main compartment and look inside. I pulled the heavy-duty zipper back and reached my hand inside the thick nylon lining. My fingers did not find a polycarbonate tracker or a hidden microphone. Instead, I pulled out a smooth, heavy wooden frame. I turned it over in my hands. It was a beautifully, professionally framed photograph taken just a few weeks ago at a local park. In the photograph, the 3 of us were standing together beneath a massive oak tree. I was standing tall, holding Lily in my arms, while Lucas stood right beside us, resting his hand firmly on my shoulder. We were all smiling the kind of authentic, unburdened smiles that only come after surviving the absolute darkest nights together. Lucas looked at me, his eyes shining with a profound, deep, emotional gratitude. He spoke with a quiet, steady voice that carried the absolute weight of a grown man who fully understood the magnitude of a father's sacrifice. He thanked me for not hesitating when he called me that night. He thanked me for believing him when the entire world was being manipulated to think he was losing his mind. He told me that when he was standing in that cold, dark kitchen, completely paralyzed by fear, my protective love was the absolute only thing that kept him breathing. He said he finally understood why I had always been so meticulously vigilant when he was growing up. I looked down at the beautiful framed photograph of the 3 generations of Cole men and women, and then I looked at my incredible son. I reached out and pulled him into a tight, heavy embrace. I told him that my job as a father did not end just because he grew up and bought his own house. I promised him that as long as I had breath in my lungs, I would always stand between him and the dark. A mother is supposed to be a safe harbor, providing unconditional love and absolute security in a highly dangerous world. But sometimes the absolute deepest cuts we will ever endure come directly from the very ones who gave us life. Vivian let her toxic obsession with absolute control completely blind her to the beautiful son she had raised. She chose corporate wealth and dark manipulation over genuine family connection. But the absolute truth about family is that it is not just defined by shared blood. It is defined by the incredible, terrifying lengths we are willing to go to protect one another when the shadows start closing in and threaten to destroy the people we cherish the most. Never apologize for trusting your gut instincts. If something feels deeply wrong in your home, or if the behavior of someone you love suddenly changes without any logical explanation, do not ignore that feeling. Investigate it closely. Protect your family at all absolute costs, even if it means you have to temporarily play the role of the villain to uncover the truth. If this story resonated with your heart and showed you the true length a father will go to protect his blood, let me know right now. Please drop a comment below with your exact city and the exact time you are watching this video. I want to know exactly where my protective community is located today. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for more real, intense stories of family justice and survival. Remember, the truth does not always need to shout to be heard. It just needs the right tracker.